everyone, and welcome to the TDWI webinar program. I'm Andrew Miller, and I'll be your moderator. For today's program, we're going to discuss how the survey reveals the state of data lakehouses, and this is part one of our two-part series. Part two is taking place December 13th, and the link to register can be found in the resource window. Our sponsor today is Dremio. And for our presentations today, we'll hear first from Fern Halper with TDWI, and we'll also be joined by Maloney with Dremio. Again, today we're going to be discussing how the survey reveals the state of data lakehouses, and our first speaker is Fern Halper. She is the Vice President and Senior Director of TDWI Research for Advanced Analytics. Fern is well known in the analytics community, having been published hundreds of times on data mining and information technology over the past 20 years. She is also the co-author of several dummies books on cloud computing and big data. Fern focuses on advanced analytics, including predictive analytics, machine learning, AI, cognitive computing, and big data analytics approaches. Fern has been a partner at industry analyst firm Hurwitz & Associates and a lead data analyst for Bell Labs. And she's taught at both Colgate University and Bentley University, and her Ph.D. is from Texas A&M University. And it's also my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, who's Maloney with Dremio. Reed is the CMO of Dremio and is a cloud, data, and AI marketing executive with a history of building and leading high-growth marketing teams at AWS, Oracle, and H2O.ai. Most recently at H2O.ai, he served as the Senior Vice President of Marketing, leading all elements of marketing for the late-stage startup. Prior to working in the technology industry, Reed was a captain in the United States Marine Corps, serving 2 tours of duty as a platoon commander in Iraq. Reed holds a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from Duke University and an MBA from the Foster School of Business at the University of Washington. Welcome to both Fern and Reed. And with that, Fern, I'll pass it over to you.
Okay, great. So thanks, Andrew. Hi, everyone. And welcome to this webinar on the state of the data lakehouse. So we're really happy you could join us. And as Andrew mentioned, this is part one of a 2-part webinar series. And today we're going to cover the state of the data lakehouse in terms of adoption. We'll also talk about an important part of the lakehouse open table formats. And then on December 13th, we'll be talking about the data lakehouse and AI and even the data mesh there. So we're going to do things a little bit differently today. We're going to share the results of not only TDWI research, but also a study that Dremio commissioned about the state of the data lakehouse. And we'll talk about factors driving interest in the lakehouse and the current state of data lakehouse adoption. As I mentioned, since open table formats are a big part of the data lakehouse, we'll also talk about those, and we'll close the discussion by talking about some best practices for getting started with the lakehouse to manage diverse data. So we're going to do this by comparing our results and Dremio. So I think it's going to be an interesting webinar. And I'm going to kick things off. I'm going to talk about what we're seeing in terms of the state of the data lakehouse, and then Reed will share Dremio's findings. So we'll basically be going back and forth on this. Okay, so first let me define what we mean by a data lakehouse. And we're saying that the data lakehouse is a platform that's a combination of a data lake and a data warehouse that provides warehouse data structures and data management functions on low-cost platforms such as cloud object stores. And so really these new platforms have blurred the distinction between the traditional data warehouse and data lake. They support and manage large volumes of diverse data along with SQL. They support BI, AI, machine learning, and other advanced analytics, and most often we see these lakehouses in the cloud. I'd say that they grew out of the fact that organizations need to collect and manage diverse data types. So it's not just about structured data, but also organizations want to make use of unstructured data like text data, for example. And they had their data warehouse for structured data and their data lake for unstructured data. But, as probably many of the data lakes evolved into large data storage platforms, that weren't performant, they weren't organized. The data quality wasn't really there, and this really led to this data lakehouse. So what are some of the characteristics or pillars of this data lakehouse? Well, first, the data lakehouse provides unified access to all data. If you think about the dual data warehouse and data lake architecture, that's really a siloed architecture, which means that data is often copied multiple times for the warehouse and the data lake. And aside from the errors that can be caused by this, it also involves duplicate development and maintenance efforts as well. And so the data lakehouse eliminates silos. And then the data lakehouse also supports diverse data types. So that includes structured data, unstructured data, as well as semi-structured data. So the data lakehouse is a platform that can store massive amounts of, all of this kinds of data. So I'm talking about structured text, video, image, audio, all of that, the type of data that organizations now want to use to enrich their data sets for analysis. And the data lakehouse typically also supports third-party data like demographic or firmographic data. Lakehouse providers typically also offer up marketplaces where buyers and sellers can exchange data. And as I was saying, all of this data can actually help to enrich data sets for analysis. So for instance, you can use data from the lakehouse together with, weather data or other industry data, maybe if you're doing some sort of logistics analysis or supply chain analysis. So that's very helpful. And then another characteristic of the lakehouse is that it supports tools for multiple user types. So this includes analytics tools. It includes open source tools like R and Python, as well as commercial BI and data science tools. And that means users don't need to jump from the data warehouse to the data lake for their analytics needs. If you think about something like machine learning and you want to, perform some sort of machine learning analysis, that's going to make use of high volumes of diverse data. So maybe you want to marry your structured data, like your billing data, with your sentiment data, which was going to come from unstructured text. And, that can really be an issue for traditional platforms where the data scientists might need to access data from both the warehouse, maybe to get at, this billing data, and then the data lake to get at the social media data that they then want to extract sentiment from. The data lakehouse supports all kinds of data. So those who need access don't have to go to multiple systems to get their data. And another key pillar is that the data lakehouse supports models in production. So I'm not talking about data models, I'm talking about predictive analytics, machine learning kinds of models. And that means that the data lakehouse is able to process the data. You build the model, and then the data lakehouse is able to process the data to actually score the model. So it's supporting these models in production. So those are some of the pillars of the data lakehouse. I want to compare the data warehouse and data lakes versus the data lakehouse just to finish up this discussion. So the first is, unlike the data warehouse that deals primarily with structured data with predefined schema, the data lakehouse can store massive amounts of both structured and unstructured data. I talked about that. And then unlike the data warehouse that supports basic analytics such as reports and dashboards, which is typically what you're doing off of your data warehouse, the data lakehouse can support compute-intensive, iterative, advanced analytics in addition to reports and dashboards. And then if you think about the data lake, unlike the data lake that supports raw data, but you really can't query it, the data lakehouse supports efficient query and analysis. So it's ACID compliant. Many data lakehouses are ACID compliant. And ACID compliance ensures that every transaction is either going to be fully completed or it's going to be fully rolled back without requiring the creation of new pipeline processes. And then unlike the data lake that often doesn't separate compute from storage, which means that when one grows, the other one needs to grow, that can be very costly. Data lakehouses separate the two, allowing each to scale independently. So while both the data warehouse and the data lake have their pros, like they've been useful for many things, they also have issues, and those are the issues that the data lakehouse attempts to fix. So what we see at TDWI is that cloud data lakehouses are rising in adoption. So here's the first of the data that we're going to compare. And so this data comes from a best practices report survey that we did on modern analytics. We did it in 2023. So we're talking about analytics such as machine learning, self-service analytics, AI, those sorts of technologies. And we asked, what data management technologies is your organization using to support modern analytics? And the respondents could select all that applied. And you could see that the cloud data warehouse is at the top. 46% of the respondents said they were using a cloud data warehouse. You can also see that the cloud data lake, if you read down the chart, that's at 26%, a few rows down. I thought this was interesting. It was the first time we saw that cloud platforms were actually used more than on-premises platforms, because you could see, some of the data warehouse on-premises, was less than the one in the cloud and so on. But what I circled was the cloud data lakehouse, and we see that 21% of respondents in the survey were already using a cloud data lakehouse. So in other surveys, I've seen that number range from like 15 to 20 something percent. And in fact, here's data from another TDWI 2023 survey. Again, it was for a best practices report. And here we asked which of the following types of data management platforms, repositories, or patterns are currently in use or planned for use by your organization to support BI, analytics, AI, ML. You could see that the dark gray is currently using, the dark blue is planning to use. Those are the two most important ones. And then we get into the light blue and the even lighter blue, which you may not be able to distinguish. And you could see that in this survey, the data warehouse on premises beat out the data warehouse in the cloud, but that more people were planning cloud implementations in general. And then if you go down the chart, you could see where I circled it here. You could see that a unified data warehouse data lake platform, e.g. the cloud data lake house, has the biggest potential for growth. So 22%, again, close to the 21% we saw in the previous survey, were using the platform today, but 46% were planning to use it. And that's bigger than any of the other platforms that's listed here, and why is that? It's because of the reasons I mentioned previously. Organizations don't like data silos, they didn't like their data swamp, and they wanted to manage and analyze diverse data in a performant manner. And then the data lakehouse, can do all of that. So I'm going to ask Reed what his data showed, but first we wanted to ask you a poll question. And the poll question is, what is the status of the cloud data lakehouse in your organization? And there are 4 responses here. Please just pick one. The first one is we've already implemented a cloud data lakehouse. The second is we're planning to implement one in the next year. The third one is we may implement it in the next few years if we need it. And then we're using a cloud data warehouse and/or a cloud data lake, but we have no plans for a cloud data lakehouse. So I'll give you a minute to input your responses, and we'll see what we have.
Yeah, thanks, Fern. Yeah, I know we have some differences in our data, so we wanted to see what the audience had to say too, in terms of triangulating on the information.
Right. So we'll see if it's, we may not see the same numbers because, people who are joining in may not be using a data lakehouse at all. Yeah. So let's see.
And I think one of the differences we'll talk about too is we didn't ask specifically on cloud data lakehouses. We asked on, data lakehouses in general, like whether they're more of in a hybrid or even on-prem kind of environment. We didn't differentiate between the two. And it's something that you'll see where our numbers are just slightly different.
All right. Well, let's see what we have here. So 27% say they've already implemented a cloud data lakehouse. Now the 31% are planning to implement it in the next year. That's good. So they'll learn more about the Dremio platform and what you're seeing there. We may implement it, and only 14% are saying that there's no plans, but obviously, they want to learn about it. So Reed, what are you all seeing?
Yeah, so one of the things that's interesting, and obviously we probably have a biased set of people attending this webinar right now, and just trying to learn more about adoption, what's going on in their data teams. But if you go to the next slide, what we ended up going into was, look, we had we first wanted to test in our survey, which went out to about 500 different individuals, is that, hey, what's going on in the lakehouse? And then, as we talked about in this particular one, we're going to talk about table formats, because without an open table format, you're just querying data that's on the lake, and you don't really actually move into this lakehouse environment. So we wanted to couple those together and look at those trends. to help everybody that's in the space figure out like what's the right decision for them. And then we also talked about data mesh and AI, right, that we're going to cover in part 2. This is live on our website today. You can go out and download the report and go read through all of the data as well. And so we have that for you. But we'll also go cover some highlights in this cast. And Fern and I are just going back and debating what we see in the data, what we think is happening in the industry right now. So if you go to the next slide, what we looked at is that we had 85% awareness of the lakehouse concept, which is just a massive change, even in the last year. So I've been at Dremio just a little over a year. We came in, we're like, how many people understand this term? And even on our website, we sort of explain the concept very early on of like, what is a data lakehouse? And the market in general, while there's a bunch of different interpretations of what a lakehouse is, and I'm sure you run into that, Fern, of like, does a lakehouse have this or have that? Or is this in the bucket or is that not in the bucket? There's this general agreement of you're going to get the flexibility of the lake, you're going to get the speed performance controls that you would generally have in a warehouse on your lake using open table formats. And so that combined is what it leads to the baseline of a warehouse. And so when we prompted people, so we did prompt them, right? This wasn't like an unaided write in what you think. This was, hey, in general, this is what the market defines as a lake house. Are you familiar with this concept? People said yes. So 85% were very familiar with the concept. So that actually surprised us. It was higher than we thought. I don't know, Fern, if that's what you're running into in your conversations too, but are you seeing sort of that general level of awareness in the market?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And even in another survey that we did, we're just talking about unified platforms in general, and the lakehouse came up there, and I think it was 80%, or more than 80% said that, that would be a big opportunity, if we could do something like that. So again, the question asked in a different way, but like a large majority of people saying that this would be an opportunity. Yeah, that they're, the lakehouse is really on the move. I was surprised when I even saw that 20-something% in our surveys, were using it because it was relatively new concept, and it's really like getting a lot of attention.
Yeah, these adoption models tend to follow value, right? Like the faster a concept's adopted, usually it's because the value difference between the current paradigm and the new paradigm is different enough. And I think that's what we're seeing in the lakehouse construct and why it's moving through the market from a just word of mouth and virality perspective so quickly. Well, again, the definitions may vary. You're going to get this, you get this genesis of the concept of like, yeah, that's where I want to run my analytics. And we sort of saw that come out. So what's interesting is, Fern, it was great. You had some data on like, hey, we have 22% using this from a cloud perspective right now, with a much broader group to use that in the next year, or yours was just planning to adopt. And when you add up even the survey of the people that are attending right now, thank you all for that. You had about a little over 50% saying they actually have adoption plans in the next year. And then you had another 20+% in on adoption after that. So that was a little over 70%, but it wasn't time bound. So ours is actually really close to that in terms of, if you're in the audience today, this is sort of what we saw. But in addition to that, we basically looked and said, how many, what do we see as the percent of analytics running? And so while we see 69% not only plan to adopt in the next 3 years, they plan that to be over 50% of their analytics in the organization. So which means in 3 years, for most organizations, it will be the predominant way that analytics are delivered. And I think that's what you're seeing is just, as the performance continues to, I would say in some ways almost shock people in terms of you just going direct query to the lake and what can be done now, and then managing that data with the open table formats. Like, I can really just start moving all of this data from a warehouse to a lake house, and I'm not seeing these negative trade-offs that I might have expected. And I think that's pushing people to see, I can actually do more of this than I thought, and I'm starting to do it faster. And that's a pattern we see with our customers, which is, and we'll talk a little bit later about starting small, how do you start, how you get going if you're not adopted in the group. But the second they see that, the adoption starts to go very quickly and the expansion starts. So I think this is a different view, but generally aligns to what you're seeing. in terms of plan to, the 48, was it 48% in 22, Fern?
46 and 22. Yeah, so pretty close. Yeah.
I think what we're seeing is there's at least some planned adoption in all aspects, but I also believe that based on the way we probably asked the questions, if you were just querying a data lake, you were throwing that type of analytics workload into this bucket too.
Yeah, I mean, organizations that, I was just going to say that organizations want to, actually, do more analytics, and they've been hampered, by a number of things. But, one of the things is, the infrastructure that they had, so this isn't surprising what I'm seeing here in your chart.
Yeah, and so like what we, part of why we're seeing that trend is like, if you look at the current state of how the data goes from the sources to end up in the customers, right? You still have this honestly, there's typically a lot of spark in the middle of all these processes, but you got to go from the source, you're e-tailing that data, you're getting it into a lake. But then again, you have to define the schema, and you're doing that for performance reasons. And so you're working back with the engineering team, and you're writing a whole other set of ETL pipelines to usually a set of data warehouses or an overall enterprise data warehouse that then might also have a whole set of different data marts across your organization. So it might even be more fractured than this. And then once you get to that, you're still trying to improve it to the client. So you might have cubes and extracts, et cetera, going on, and you just end up in this really challenging set and scenario where it just takes too long. The mean time to insight is I got to talk to an engineer to do this, who has to talk to maybe even another engineering team to do that. And by the time you're back to, I was just trying to answer this question or set up this report in Tableau or Power BI, it just takes too long. And then you start looking at the checks you're writing, and then you start looking at how are you managing that code, right? Like, how are you managing the code in between and even managing the sequences? And every time we talk to engineers, they're like, I'm spending 30% of my time backfilling data based on largely unsupported pipelines that created some data set at some point, and they're going back and trying to, we'll say fix that. They didn't even know it was in production. And so I think the lake's really why we see the lake come up. And this is not, necessarily specific to Dremio, and we're obviously a lake house and a big component of this, but we see these advantages sort of across the lake house adoption spectrum, which is you're really trying to simplify all of that complexity, which is you take out the warehouse need directly. You can query from clients at really high speed directly into the lake, and you're getting much closer to just doing raw source loads. In this case, from the source, you're transforming it into your table format of choice, because if you don't do that, you don't know that it landed. You don't have ACID compliance, so you want to land it directly into that format. But this is really what we see as the drivers, and what's that led us to is to talk about why our company is moving. And what we found is one of the big ones, not unsurprisingly, is cost. So if you look at all the cost and complexity in that cycle, and in that process from going from source to the client to the actual value for the business. So we see that of the people that are adopting the lake houses, 56% of them think they're saving more than 50%, with 20% saying they're saving more than 76% by moving to a lake house. So a way to look at this is to say there's really only a smaller population that thinks their savings is in the 25%-ish range. And as you go through up the chart, you start to see much higher cost savings. And this aligns with TCO analysis that we've done. And I would say it actually underrepresents what we hear from our customers. Our customers are often in the 70 to 80% range. Although a lot of our customers are enterprise customers. And when we filtered our data by 10,000 and above, the 76 to 100% group actually went up to 38%. So that speaks to, I think you're seeing we'll see better returns to cost within the enterprise than you see in the overall market. I don't know, Fern, does that align to what you're seeing too?
Well, I don't have a lot of data on that. And I had a question for you on that. So it's 50, they're saving more than 50% with the lakehouse versus sort of any other type of platform.
That's right. For versus something else for analytics. Let's call it any other analytics platform. Yeah.
Okay.
It's
Yeah.
we just compared it to current state for Fern. So it could have been like, hey, this is compared to a cloud data warehouse, or this is compared to an enterprise data warehouse. Both of those options are possible in the way that we phrase the question.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we have data, again, on cloud and cloud data warehouses and cloud data lakes, saying that the top surprise, if you will, that organizations had with the cloud was the cost, so I don't know if these are the reasons why they're saying that the cost was higher, but some of them might be, if you know what I mean. So,
yeah, it could be. Yeah. I mean, I know recently, like obviously in the current economic sort of uncertainty, it's hard to say that, there's an economic problem, but I would just say general uncertainty, and especially like pressure on data organizations right now from a budget perspective. We've seen costs become a much bigger element of driver, where they want to keep the data democratization, and they want to keep the self-service and the push to move faster going, but they're balancing that with a flat or maybe declining budget. A lot of times, as long as they have a flat budget, but they have this push to do more with even, and I think that's putting a lot of pressure to say, hey, if I could offload this, if I could reduce the number, the whole web of ETL processes we have to move from, get it from this view to this view to this materialization to this aggregation to this summary, all of those different items add up and need to be maintained, and it just gets really expensive with all the systems in the middle. So if you just start shifting that left to the business, can you start seeing? Can you start getting those savings, and can you compute against that data more efficiently? And the market's telling us yes right now.
Interesting.
And that would align with the adoption of lakehouses being fast, right, Fern? Like awareness wasn't as high a year ago. It's really built up this year. The adoption's going quick, so there has to be value drivers. The other one that showed up, and this is in the report for everybody that's listening, I don't have a slide on it, was around ease of use and self-service. And so that was 46% of people said that one of the reasons they were adopting a lakehouse, again, was the ability to essentially move faster. Just, Fern, you mentioned it eliminates silos earlier in the presentation. So that we asked a lot of different questions around it, and we bucketed a few together to say, yeah, we think that's about what we're trying to get at, was about 46% of people. So that was a main driver for them.
Yeah, I mean, that's always the driver. I mean, as I said, organizations want to move to unified. They want to try to unify things, make things simpler. They want one source of the truth for data governance. Yeah, they want self-service is their top priority. They're trying to make things easier.
Yeah, so it's like it's sort of not compromising. The Lakehouse helps you maybe not compromise as much, where you can deliver better self-service, and you can do so while reducing your costs. And so you sort of end up in the best of both worlds for that. And that's probably what's driving the adoption high. So not surprisingly, if you guys remember, and you guys meaning the audience, if you look back to what Fern presented, the top technology people are using today is cloud data warehouses. And number 2 is enterprise data warehouses. So it should be no surprise that's where the data is coming from. It was a little bit of a surprise to me, because I was like, look, if you already have a data lake, it's pretty simple to just go and say, well, we're going to go and move that and make some changes to move that into a lakehouse. It seems like there would be less movement of data to go and do that. And what we've seen is the number one source is actually cloud data warehouses. And so, why do we think that's happening? We think it's for 2 reasons. Okay. Number one is it's really highly used. It's a really highly used platform. Okay. But if people are moving from it, there must be pain. What is that pain? And the pain we hear a lot is actually cost, which is I want these types of benefits that I get from the cloud data warehouse, which have generally done a pretty good job of separating compute and storage. But you just run into these massive cost runs because you're just you're defining the schema, and then you're running against it, and you're letting everybody go, and then all of a sudden the costs surprise you, and you just end up with this really, really expensive bill at the end of the month.
That's so interesting, because it makes me think about the fact that I used to see not used to like so long ago, but like used to over like a couple of years ago, would see like 55% of respondents using cloud data warehouses, And now the number seems lower. And I wonder if some of them, it's what you say, that they went from the cloud data warehouse to the cloud data lake house,
Well, I think I think it's slightly different, which is, this isn't the number that are still using the warehouse, right? This is where's the data going into the lakehouse. So it's the leading source to the lakehouse. So, if 86%, which I think was your slide, we're using a cloud data warehouse today. Well, if that's the predominant way analytics are done today, and that predominant way is not supporting the goals of data organizations, which is help the business, reduce mean time to insight, MTTI, reduce mean time to insight, and do so on a shrinking or smaller budget, something has to give, something has to change. And there's really, to us, the way we see the market, there's only one architecture that really gets you there. And we see that's probably where the adoption's high here. And we know people have been moving on from enterprise data warehouses for a long time for a wide variety of reasons, cost being one, often scale being another. And so I'm not surprised to see those show up. I just thought the data lake would be number one. I was wrong.
Yeah, that's a good point. But it's also interesting to me that also suggests to me that organizations are still primarily thinking about structured data, if that's what was in their cloud data warehouses, and to me, there's so much value that one of the big values of the data lake and the data lake house, is that you can be analyzing more diverse data, which I think is where the real value lies. And, organizations are just starting to move down, that path. And hopefully this data lake house, will help. We just did a best practice report on diverse data. And I was heartened to see that data like text data, was actually being used more often, that organizations were starting to analyze that. And like the example I gave, marrying it together, there's just so much value to be had there. And that's what we see when organizations are doing that. So hopefully that portends, that they will also be, doing more with it in this new type of environment. We'll see.
We still see, though, is if you look at, we'll say, including semi-structured data like JSON, if you bring these in together, we still see a lot of organizations, like whether it's I'll use customer C360 or supply 360, like even without using the unstructured bits or analyzing the unstructured bits to structure them, which obviously is a common use case for AI, right? You're basically reading through a bunch of the unstructured data, and then what are you doing? You're adding attributes or tags to the data, and you're essentially creating more metadata on top of data. And that's a great use case. But we see even things where it's just like you would think it's more basic, still haven't been done. And the reason is, again, the data's stuck in silos. It's too hard to query across these sources, or if you can get the query across the source, it's too slow to actually be something you could put into a daily dashboard or something that's even hourly, whatever that is. It's like you just end up in these like system limitation problems, and you're back into, hey, we thought we solved this 5 years ago, we still haven't solved it as a group. And again, I think that's part of that. That's part of that ease of use bucket. It's hard for us to peel off sometimes whether the ease of use is more like, hey, I'm breaking down the data silos, or whether it's more, hey, these user interfaces to create views are so much better. I can let the business just rock and roll now. But that grouping is obviously some type of key driver into the lakehouse right now. Okay.
Yeah. Well, yeah, let's talk about the next trend. Let's talk about these open table formats, because that's another thing that we're seeing. An open table format, that refers to a method of organizing and storing data in a structured format that's compatible and interoperable with various processing systems. Obviously table formats have been around since, relational database management systems, but, you're trying to structure a data set's files in a way that you can get at your data, and in a performant way. And then this open table format, it's open in the sense that it's not proprietary to any specific software or vendor, and it can be used and accessed by a wide range of tools and technologies. And the data lakehouse open table format makes it efficient for both data warehousing and data science workloads that use diverse data. And I just put some key characteristics of, this open table format, schema on read. The schema is applied at the time of reading the data rather when the data is stored, so that can help with diverse data sets. These open table formats like Iceberg often supports schema evolution, which allows the structure of the data, like the schema of a table, to change over time without the need to rewrite old data, right? That's one of the innovations of Apache Iceberg that we'll talk about. I mean, this is particularly important for managing large data sets that evolve. The schema doesn't have to conform to specific file formats. Many open table formats, we talked about this, include support for advanced features like ACID transactions, efficient metadata handling like the metadata trees in Iceberg, hidden partitioning, and optimizing for query performance. And there are several of these open table formats. Datalake is one, Apache Iceberg is one, Apache Hudi, that's another. Those are three popular open source data table formats that are supposed to make it easier to manage large amounts of data in the Lakehouse. So here I'm highlighting Apache Iceberg, which is an open table format that's designed for large analytic data sets. I think it was created like 5 years ago at Netflix to solve some of the problems that Netflix was having with Hive, using Hive with Hadoop. And Iceberg focuses on defining tables as lists of files. I put this as the second bullet, instead of a list of directories and subdirectories that was done with Hive, that was associated with Hadoop. So systems like Apache Iceberg and Delta Lake, they define tables directly as a list of files, that can be stored in object stores, which allows these systems to better utilize modern cloud architectures and distributed computing paradigms. Now, I've also listed some of the features of Iceberg, including things like expressive SQL, the fact that there's a rich set of features, that SQL features that enable complex queries and data manipulations on the data lakehouse. And Iceberg also supports a variety of query engines. There's schema evolution, which we talked about, because tables change, whether that means you're adding or removing something or renaming something, and this is a significant innovation in Iceberg because you don't have to rewrite existing data. There's things like hidden partitioning, where the system automatically organizes data into partitions, but the end user doesn't have to worry about that. There's time travel and rollback, which allows users to query data at a previous point in time, and that enables the examination of historical data or recovery from accidental data changes. There's also things like data compaction, that refers to the process of optimizing storage by consolidating smaller files into larger ones, and that can improve performance and reduce the overhead associated with managing a large number of small files. So also Iceberg has the scalable metadata management system. That's another innovation, to make it easier to manage large data sets. So, in terms of what we're seeing, and this is the second set of data to compare, this is data from that other best practice report I showed you before. And in it, we asked which of the following types of data management systems, platforms, storage, cloud services, and technology standards are currently in use or planned for future use. So it's the same story, where the dark gray is currently using and the dark blue is planning to use. And I blocked off three of the three table formats, Hive, Delta Lake, and Apache Iceberg. And you could see that 26% of the respondents cited Hive, close to 20% cited Iceberg and Delta Lake. They were sort of tied. And they were also sort of tied in our data in terms of Delta Lake and Iceberg in terms of, planning to use. Like, in fact, the bars seem pretty similar. We wanted to ask you all, what table formats does your organization use? And you can select more than one if you want here. I mean, I put Hive, I put Iceberg, I put Delta Lake, I put Hudi, and then I put other. So let's see if we can get some data here. Give you
and this one, Fern, is one where I think our data is slightly different. We'll compare and see what we think about that. It's not too far off, but there's definitely some adoption differences in terms of planned adoption that we saw in our survey. Yeah, and it'll be interesting to you ask this as multi question, because we'll definitely run into customers who have multiple formats, because there might be one that's running from the central team, but then hey, business wants to support some other tools, et cetera, and then they have another format, and then that's led to all this talk about catalogs that's going on right now in this whole table format concept.
And I realize I should have put, we don't use it at all, but I think that people will put other, if that's the case. So,
yeah, you mean if they're just using Parquet, right? I mean, they're not using the table format. Yeah, it's almost more like none.
But that's why I think, I see more people coming in now, because I think that people weren't using it, which makes sense because they were saying that, they're planning to use it. So.
Yeah, if only 20% had adopted a lakehouse that are on right now,
right,
then you're gonna most of them are probably have none here, because you're gonna have to have a table format. Although you see a lot of Hive adoption in sort of the data lake,
right,
construct, and it's still out there a lot, and we see that as well. The question is whether, it obviously can't do a lot of what. I'd say the groups that are using Hive extensively now in more of a lakehouse format have done a lot of work to have it work, and the rest of are adopting more of the format sort of built for doing this, either data lake or Delta Lake or Apache Iceberg.
Yeah, let's see. Yeah, well, here we have, okay, well, a lot of the people are using Delta Lake. They're not using Iceberg. They're using either Delta Lake, Hive, or other, which probably means that a lot of them aren't using anything. And so that's interesting, I think.
Yeah.
Well,
I think it's sort of where the group is right now. If we go, if we go to the next slide, Fern, like what in terms of what our data is showing, we'll go back one here. So when we ask just in general, have you adopted an open table format? We had 56% answer this question as yes. Okay, and this could be, hey, look, I have a data lake and I'm using Hive. That could be part of it. But the way we phrased it specifically, what's on there, which is like such as Apache Iceberg, and then we basically looked at adoption timeframes. And so almost 56% had adopted a format, whereas another 25.7 had basically plans to in the next year. And so if you look at that all together, that would mean in the next year, we're looking at over 71% are basically saying, look, we'll have adopted a format, and that will put them in some form of a lakehouse construct. And what's interesting, that's slightly higher, right? Then I think, unless you add up yours, Fern, the 22%, plus the 46% plan to adopt was all the next year, that would land you in somewhere the next ballpark. But I think what we're seeing in the data right now is people say, yeah, I have an open table format. Some of that's going to just, hey, we use Hive today. We got Hive tables, and we got a Hive we got some sort of Hive metastore that we're using to manage those tables. And I think in the lakehouse, we're generally seeing adoption into the table formats change from Hive, as you can see here. So where you had Iceberg and Delta Lake being roughly equivalent in adoption today, our survey returned that Delta Lake had more adoption today than Iceberg, which was next. And then you see Huddy, and then obviously Hive's moving. And so that tells me a little bit of that in the interpretation of the survey, that our customers were largely looking forward into sort of what we'll call lakehouse table formats and away from legacy formats. But some, I think, based on what they've done with Hive, the investment they've made into Hive and how they plan to make that work in the sort of lakehouse world, is they're going to be sticking with it. So that would align with customers I've been talking to. What we see, though, in terms of planned adoption, if you look at all the planned adoption that's happening in the next 3 years, Iceberg starts to take over from a format choice. So there's sort of the, what is it looking backwards, and what will it be looking forwards? And we've definitely seen a shift towards Iceberg, at least with our customers, in the last year. And we support both. So just for everyone on right now, like you can do all read operations. So you can go and define logical data marts. We have ways where we accelerate those. We're really fast across doing data both in the lake and in other RDBMSs and federating across that. And you can do that with both Delta Lake and Iceberg. But when it comes to all the write operations we support, copy into, creating tables, deletes, updates, et cetera, all the DML ops, that's all going to be done with Iceberg, okay, as a format. And there's a reason why we did that. And it's a reason why we think that the planned adoption, and this relates to why people are choosing formats, which is also in our full paper that's on our site. We think this is related to ecosystem. And so what I'm showing here is this is the contributions that are a part of the different of both Delta Lake and Iceberg in terms of updating and advancing on the table format. And as you can see with Databricks, it's over 91% is specific, or for Delta Lake, it's over 91% from Databricks. And so when we went and we're looking strategically as a company on, hey, which format are we going to support? We wanted to support the one that was, the open Apache project, and clearly had a really diverse group that was fueling it. And if you go and you look at actually the ecosystem developing, the ecosystem that's developed around Iceberg's bigger, the open source ecosystem available around Iceberg is bigger. And obviously there's some competitive items here because Databricks won't actually let you write into Iceberg. So we see the market now with Stripe and ourselves and Netflix and Apple and Tabular and LinkedIn and all these groups, AWS as well, investing in Iceberg is sort of, that's the viewpoint of the open standard. And that's what we think we saw with ORC to Parquet, where they were sort of like, hey, what's going to happen? In general, while ORC's out there, Parquet became the standard. That could happen here or something else. There's a lot going on in this space right now, could continue to emerge. And, we're generally, as Dremio, open to the one that or focus on the one that we think is open and allows customers the choice to really own their data and be as productive with their data as possible. So that's our guess as to why the Iceberg adoption's higher for planned than Delta. But when we ask the question directly and we give you all the raw results in the table, in the paper, it wasn't 100% clear. There were a bunch of different choices that customers made, including performance being one of the key elements too.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And yeah, and our data showed that they were pretty equal, which is interesting also because I hear companies talking, at least in our audience, talking a lot about Delta Lake, but when we surveyed them, they were also talking about Iceberg. So, and they were created for two different things, but maybe as organizations, have needs they really need to address performance issues. If that many were using Hive, maybe they're going to be moving to, more to Iceberg also. So
I mean, the data suggests that, Fern, like it suggests that they will be, but I think in the end it goes, companies are going to have need to work within the platforms that work best for their requirements. And I think the note that we're seeing is most companies that go into we'll call it the Databricks world, they're going to use Delta Lake, just based on the way that they've set that up. Like if you want to do your pipelines using Databricks, you're going to be writing into Delta Lake. And then once you have Delta Lake in that environment, you're sort of in more of the overall Databricks ecosystem. And, we see that being, the concern of, well, now with your data actually open, can you get locked in by a vendor again, like has happened over and over again, where you had things like Teradata, and then we're like, oh, we're all good. We have cloud data warehouses, and then everyone's looking at the cost bill there again. It's like, well, what's actually the open standard? When I look at a table like this, when we look at the contributions, our bet was that Iceberg's the open standard. And our view as Dremio, where we co-creators Apache Arrow, is we want to be associated with all the tools that can be done in your format. And so, our bet on the right data is with Iceberg.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see, because even as we said, it's even though adoption has been faster than I thought it would be, it's still it's still relatively early. So I want to definitely save time for audience Q&A, because I see some questions coming in, but we wanted to conclude this talking about some best practices, and Reed also wanted to share a little bit more about Dremio with you. But, really, what are some best practices for getting started with the data lakehouse? I mean, obviously, it first includes understanding your needs and your goals, like we were just saying. What are the use cases, what are your needs? What use cases does it make sense to start with? What problem are you solving? You're probably going to start small, but it's important to know why you're doing what you're doing. You're going to have to think about the lakehouse platform stack that's going to fit your needs, and what's that going to look like, and how are you going to get there? I have, planning for integration, but don't forget about data governance. What we see, I just always want to put this, in the planning stages. Don't keep it as an afterthought, because that's what a lot of organizations do, and we consistently see. Then that data governance becomes a top priority and it's a top challenge, but don't wait for it, think about it up front, even with the data lakehouse. And, then you're going to have to determine, how you're going to manage your platform and optimize for performance. And it's also going to be important to monitor what you have in place. So, Reed, do you want to tell us a little bit about Dremio and some best practices you view for getting started?
Sure. Just like one interesting note on governance is we have a customer that, obviously there's requests for data. So you get into the platform and you can see all this data that's there. And you say, oh, well, I want access to that. So, in a lot of cases, you'd be cutting a ticket to a team to say, hey, I'd like access. Well, they put AI in the middle of that with the governance team as a human in the loop. And so in certain cases where they knew what was in the data, they would say, oh, there's no problem with that. And so the AI would grant access. And then in other cases where it was like, we're not so sure based on this job role and this part of the department and what the data is that they should get access, they'd bring the human in the loop. And I thought it was, a pretty innovative way that people are, going in this very large enterprise that has to deal with just tons of requests that come in. How do you, again, get the access to the customer, to your business as they need it in a way that reduces time to insight, but does so in a very safe manner. So yeah, absolutely. Going to a couple of things with Dremio as you go back to some of the initial slides we looked at about just what's happening in the market now in terms of going from source to delivering data that's highly performant to the business, to the end customers, is we have specific technology at Dremio that's attacked each of these different elements. So we have a way where we have a query engine where it's intelligent enough to be able to understand different ways or to be able to rewrite the query live. So what we might do is have your business go and create a view, and they're going to write a view and they're going to write a query against it. But that view is a logical view of the data. And if you have lots of stacked logical views, in the end, you could get poor performance. What we have is a technology called reflections, where we will help you understand and then recommend, hey, this aggregation of the data or summarization of your data should be created so that you maintain really high performance while you let the business go and basically create the views and essentially virtual data warehouses that are right for them. And the query engine smart enough to say, yes, I know you wrote this query towards this view, but what you really want is to have written this query and go and hit the summarization. And so that allows many things to happen, but one of them is it allows the business to go and have a lot more freedom to operate without really slowing down and bogging down the system by creating all these virtualized data marts, but then having the technology to ensure they still run really, really fast. And then the other part of that is we also see this move going into the data lake becoming more from an ETL to more of a raw load. Now they are going to there's still a transformation into the table format that you've chosen, but after that, we'll how do you version that? How do you ensure that the data, especially the data products that you're creating as a company and then exposing to the business, are accurate and clean and verified? And so we've brought in Git-inspired data versioning. So you can actually branch, add the data to it, merge it back into the main branch and version your data. And so it's a way to make all of these different really complicated things that happen in the data lifecycle right now to go from, hey, I'd like to have a data set that looks like this for a report, to actually build in the report and truncate that down. And what that also does is it just lowers your costs. So we become a fraction of the cost of other analytics offerings because we're targeting the pain that exists right now in between all these stages to get data to the customers. And so in general, our customers are improving their mean time to insight between 8 to 10x. We have a set of customer stories like Amazon. Amazon's a great customer of ours, where within their supply chain group, they were able to vastly improve their speed time to insight by using a tool like us. Again, the cost and complexity goes down. Most of our customers, as I mentioned earlier, are seeing 70 to 80% savings over currently what they're doing with analytics. We've also done a TCO report that we've put out, and so that shows how the Lakehouse is much less expensive than current offerings. And then you can see you're really simplifying all that data management, because as you now need to have these data products coming in and you're exposing them to the business so that they can go out and build their own virtual data marts, and we're accelerating that with our technology called Reflections. You've now simplified all that because you have a version control level across all of it. So that's really what it comes. We really view this bringing all your analytics together, because it can be in the lake, or it can be in Oracle or other RDBMSs, and you can federate across that. So you're really getting this unified approach for self-service analytics, and you're doing so at a fraction of the cost. So with that, Fern, last pitch here, you can get started for free. So we have both software and cloud versions. They're completely free. There's no time limits. You can just get in, use it in what makes sense for you on data. And so what we see a lot of customers start with is picking just one or two use cases. And you probably heard that before, like, how do you go do this? Well, look, if you already have data in the lake, which most customers do, start with the data that's already in the lake. Don't start by re-platforming an entire pipeline. And then go and experience the different, the difference in terms of being able to query that data directly off the lake, manage it in the lake, and expose it to one department. Allow them to define the different data assets they need in a virtual manner and still get that performance. That's a really great way to start. And we see a lot of customer use cases start really either in the customer 360 area, whether that's financial services or retail, those types of industries, or whether we see it over more on supply chain. And we see a lot of different groups in on the supply chain side, Fern.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you both. That was a fantastic conversation there. We don't have a whole lot of time for questions, so I'm going to jump right into the one question we have time for today. So Reed, this is for you. You mentioned that users are satisfied, generally speaking, with their experience of data lakehouses. But this person asked if there's any areas identified for improvement based on user feedback.
Improvement, I don't know who asked the question. I mean, I'm going to have to take a stab, I guess, because we can't ask you whether it's improvement for lakehouses in general or improvement for Dremio. Maybe I'll stick to improvement for lakehouses in general. I think if you look at it's sort of I'm going to go back to warehouses for a second. If you look at warehouses and all the associated code that was written, even around things like UDFs, et cetera, that help to expand the usability of the platform into multiple ways to customize it. I see that as still an improvement area that you could say is needed for lakehouses. The other one is, what we have a point of view on, so this is sort of a biased one, which is we want to make sure that you could do your entire pipeline, end-to-end source to getting it to the customer with SQL. We sort of view SQL being the the language of business, and one that's really going to help customers continue to democratize analytics and data and the use of it across every single question, every single part of what they're doing in their organizations. And so I still think that has a ways to come from an adoption standpoint in with the Lakehouse environment. So it's just that whole area to simplify in will make it even faster for the business to get the data sets that they need while they're working. And as a marketer, near to dear to my heart, I have a bunch of people on our team, and we use Dremio internally as our own lakehouse, and we are always trying to find ways to move faster.
All right, fantastic. Well, unfortunately, this does leave us with no time remaining today. So I would like to thank our speakers, and if you'd like to, you can follow up for part 2. I would like to thank Fern Halper with TDWI and Reed Maloney with Dremio. I would also like to thank Dremio for sponsoring today's webinar. And lastly, from all of us here, let me say thank you so much for attending. This does conclude today's event.